Hey everyone, in this video, I'll show you how to level up your websites and presentations with interactive bullet points. There's a link to the source file in the video description. If you'd like to follow along, you can download the file, or you can use the open and arrive button if you just want to get in the file, poke around, and see how things are set up. So with that being said, let's hop into it. So I've got two examples for you today. We're going to start with this lock icon where we'll go through everything. We'll do all the animations together and then set up the state machine and sort of talk through the concepts of how this actually works. And then I have a second icon that I'll show you the animations that I've created in the state machine that I've created. And then I'm going to challenge you to actually go in and apply the concepts from this lock to that one. Now it's a little bit more complex, so you have to think a little bit as you're building it. But I think if you apply the things that you're learning with the lock to that, you should be able to nail it, no problem. Okay, so before we actually start animating, let's look and see how the file's set up and sort of talk through the concepts that we're going to be using. So as always, I've got my assets set up on a root group. Now, for this in particular, it's really important that you set up these root groups, and that's because we don't exactly know if our bullet point is the right scale until we actually implement this into our presentation or our website, whatever we're going to be doing. And we may need to scale it up or scale it down. We don't know. So we want to make sure that we have that flexibility. Now, we don't want to add any animation keys to this root group to control the entire composition. I've built this main group for that reason. Now, this main group, what we're going to use it for is actually adding a little bit of bounce to the animation. So we'll shrink it down, scale it up, and then bounce it into place. So that's what the main group here is going to be used for when we animate. Now, below that, we've also got our bullet point, which is just an ellipse. And then we've got our icon. So when you're setting this up with your groups, you want to make sure that you have your bullet point group and your lock icon. Now, the reason that I separated them into the groups is that if I just, you don't have to, but what I don't want to do is have to scale up and figure out what each one of these shapes are. So it's easier if I put all of this stuff on a group. Now, the only thing to note about the artwork itself, because it's very simple, is we've got this rectangle shape with this ellipse punched out of the center of it. Now, the way I did that was by utilizing multiple paths on a shape and then changing the winding order. Now, what winding order does, without getting too technical with it, is it's how the editor decides what part of a shape should be filled in when multiple paths intersect. So when paths have the same winding order and they intersect, depending on your fill type, everything is going to be filled in. When they have opposite winding directions, wherever those paths intersect, they're gonna the intersecting area is not going to. So let me show you what I mean by that. So let's just sort of build the lock up here. Just quickly run through this. Edit my corner radiuses. All right, so now I want to punch a hole out of the center of this. So to do that, I'm just going to create an ellipse, just like that, centered on the lock, like so. And then I'm going to take this path layer and drop it onto that rectangle. Now, we could have done it the other way where we drop the rectangle onto the ellipse. It doesn't really matter. You just need to have both of your path layers under one shape layer. Now we can delete the unused shape layer. And you can see, like I said, when the winding order is in the same direction, overlapping paths will basically, everything is going to fill even where they overlap. Now, when we change the winding direction, so to do that, I'm going to go into the ellipse path here, and we got to convert it to a custom shape, and then use this reverse direction button. And you can see that that punches a hole in the shape there. So that's how you use winding direction to sort of punch the holes out. Now, the reason I did that hole punch is if I have, let's say a gray, let's say I have a gray or something, some kind of background. I want to be able to see through the lock to the other side. Now, you don't have to do this. You could just have an ellipse here, an ellipse shape here if you don't care about seeing your background. But in this case, I went ahead and just added that ellipse. So all of the principles are going to be basically the same either way you do it. Now, the other thing that I've done is added another ellipse to this path layer here that I can scale up, and it will punch a hole in the bullet point. Now, the reason that we're doing that is we're going to morph during the animation. We're going to morph the ellipse here into a rectangle, like so, and then scale up this thing that we're punching out and reposition it to get a shape that's roughly the same as the main shape of the lock. Now, this is going to be how you do almost any icon. Now, the thing that's going to be different is the amount of points that you actually need on your ellipse. So with this, a rectangle is really easy because it's 4 points. But when you get to more complex shapes, you may need to add some different points here that you can. So let's just have an example really quick. So let's say we wanted to make something a little more complex that's not a rectangle. We can do something like this. Okay. So that gets kind of maybe like some glasses or something like that. So you want to make sure you have enough points that whatever shape your icon is, you can morph this ellipse into a shape that's relatively close to the shape that you're going for. So that's one of the main concepts that you need to get out of this. Now let's actually look at the animation to see how I did it in the animation. So here is the bullet point in its idle state. You see we got keys here, but we do have a dot idle animation, which is just this. So it's going to start looking like the bullet point. And then, like I said, we're going to use this main group here to add that squash and stretch bounciness. Now, between where the bullet point gets the smallest and where it's the largest, that's where we're going to actually animate the vertices to sort of start morphing it into that lock shape. And then we're going to use opacity to turn off the bullet point so that the lock is the only thing left that you see. And there's a seamless transition where you almost can't even tell where the bullet point is turned off and the lock icon is the only thing left on. So that's the main thing that we're going to be doing here. Now from here, you don't have to add in this next animation, but this is a idle animation for once the lock is actually open, or once the user has moused over whatever your bullet point is, it's transformed. And as long as they're hovering over that, you have an idle animation to go along with it until we go back to this dot idle. So let's look at the state machine. Now you can see I've got the state machine set up in sort of a circular transition so that we can go to each one of our states. So let's go ahead and preview this. So you can see that our bullet point starts in this idle configuration until somebody comes over here and hovers over it, in which case the hovered Boolean will be set to true. And then you'll get the transition animation, and then we'll have this idle animation play until they move their mouse off of it, in which case it'll be false, and we can go back down to our bullet point. So the state machine is relatively simple. We'll dive a little bit deeper into it on how I set it up as we actually start building this. So I think we know what we're building. Let's go ahead and jump into animate mode and start from scratch and actually build these animations out. Okay, so we're in animate mode and we're ready to get this thing going. So what we're going to do is start with the bullet point idle animation. So let's go ahead and rename our animation here, bullet idle. And what we need to do is set the bullet point up in its idle position. So to do that, we need to scale the lock group down so that it's hidden behind the ellipse here. And I've scaled it down quite small. The other thing that we want to do is make sure that we set the opacity on this to 0. Because as I mentioned when we were looking at the animations, we're going to be turning the lock idle on, and we'll turn the bullet point off using opacity. So that's another thing that we can set up. We can go ahead and set a key for the opacity of our bullet point group. And And I want to set up a key for the main group here and go ahead and just make sure its scale is set so that we know that, because we are going to be using this main group to add a little squash and stretch. And so we want to make sure that it has this value to come back to. Now, the other thing that we need to go ahead and do is go into our bullet point shape here and key some of the main properties that we're going to be changing. So like I said, we're going to be moving these vertices around to make that lock shape. So we want to make sure that because they're going to move in another animation, we key them in this position, in this idle animation, so that if we ever mix back to this animation, it has keys that it can come back to. So we've got those set. Now for this path here, we're going to be using scale. So I've got those scale keys set there. Let's make sure everything else is keyed. So we've got the opacity for this, scale for that. Got the paths set up, and scale and opacity for the lock group. Okay, perfect. So I think we're ready to go and move on to the next animation. So let's create another one and call that animation on hover. I'm going to add an underscore there. Let me go ahead and do that to this name as well. Okay. All right. So for this animation, we want it to start from this position. So we can go ahead and copy these keys and paste them onto the on hover animation, because we're going to transition from this bullet idle to this animation here. So we need it to start in this configuration. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is animate that bouncy effect on the main group, because it's going to inform us the timing for the lock as well as the vertex animations that we're going to be adding. So I don't know the exact timing that I want to use yet, so I'm just going to go ahead and place keys at every 10 milliseconds, and then we'll go back and adjust it. So the first motion that we're going to have is we're going to have the group squash down, and this is going to be used for anticipation for the main group to scale up. So I'm going to go forward 10 milliseconds, then go ahead and scale the group up. Now we don't have to get crazy with the scale here. I'm just going to make it slightly larger than its final size, so like 110%. And the reason for that is we're going to scale the lock up, and the lock is much larger than this ellipse here. So we don't need, like I said, we don't need to get crazy with the scale. And then from there, we want to make a bouncing as it goes into its final position. So we don't want to go straight back to 100%. Let's go just a little bit smaller than that. So let's go to like 95 and then go back to 100%. So let's take a look at that. Okay, it looks all right, but once we add easing, I think it'll look a little bit better. So I'm just going to select all the keys and then add that cubic easing in. Okay, it looks all right, but I think the timing between the second and third key, there's not enough time there. So I'm going to just grab all my keys here and give it an extra 5 milliseconds. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, it looks okay, but I really want that that motion to be more punchy, be a little bit quicker and snappier. So what I'm going to do is adjust the easing here of that second key and give it some more ease in, and that should really help us create a little bit more snappiness. Okay, that's a little more punchy, so I like that. So I like the timing that we have set up now. Now what we can do is use the timing that we just created to add in the rest of the motion. So for the lock, we want to scale it up first, because that's going to inform how we go ahead and animate our vertices for our dot paths. So I'm going to drag all these keys over to 10F, because I don't want the lock to start scaling up until this motion here between the second and third key. So from where the bullet point is at its smallest to where it's at its largest. So this is where we want the lock to be at its largest, so we can return it to 100%. All right, we can't see it, so we need to use the opacity to turn it on. All right, so set a key for 100. And now you can see that the opacity is slowly changing, which is not what we want. We want the opacity to stay at 0% until we want it to turn on. So we'll change the easing of this first opacity key for our lock group from linear to hold. And that way it'll hold that opacity until it gets to the next key that we've set. Now we are going to adjust the timing of this because we're going to want it back here a little bit. But before we do that, we can go ahead and animate the dot paths. So we're going to use the same timing again and go ahead and drag these dot path keys over to our second key here, because again, we don't want any of this to move until the transition between where our group is at its smallest and at its largest. So let me expand that. And let's start with the main path here. So our ellipse. So we've already set the keys for their initial position. So let's go to the end position here. And then I'm just going to start dragging things out like so. Now we don't need the shape to be perfect, and in fact, I'm trying to keep it inside of that lock shape. Like so. I think that's probably okay. Maybe we can scoot these out just a little bit. And so you can see how the snapping is kind of making it difficult to position it exactly where I want it. Well, if you hold Command or Control, you can turn that snapping off. So I can get it a little bit closer to the edge there. Maybe I can scoot it down a little bit too. All right, now we can use snapping to help us align everything. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. So we've got this moving out where we want it to be, and then you can see the lock turns on there. We're going to turn it on a little bit earlier. But now what we want to do is go ahead and scale this second path up to cut that hole out. So I'm going to go to here, because remember, we've already set that scale key, and I'm going to scale this up. Okay, so it's at a position, so I need to move it. Scale it up a little more. And I'm going to do the same thing I did before, just make it slightly smaller. Oops. Make it slightly smaller than the final position. Okay, that looks pretty good. But you can see that I didn't key the position here. So I actually need to delete these position keys and key the position at the beginning, and then go back and reposition this like so. Okay. Now what we want to do is we want to change the easing for these two keys, the dot and the lock group here, because they're not matching the easing for our entire group, and it's making it look a little odd. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the easing curve from there, select both of my first keys, and then paste those values right there. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now the problem is that when we added the key to our lock group, it overrode our hold key. So I'm going to go back and switch that back. Okay. So for the most part, it looks good, but you can see that the locking mechanism up on top is sort of snapping in. Now, this is where it's going to take us a little bit of time to get things right. The other thing I want to do before we actually move on here is set up our opacity key for our bullet point group. So I'm just going to drag that over. Now you don't need to, because remember when we set up opacity keys for something like this, where we're going to switch out two assets, we're going to be using that hold interpolation. So we really could leave it over there, but just for organization, I'm going to move it over. Now I'm going to go here to where the lock is turned on and turn this off. Be sure to set this key here to hold. Okay, so we still have that snapping going on. So what we're going to do to fix the snapping, we're going to adjust where the bullet group turns off and the lock group turns on. So I'm going to expand both of those groups, and right now I'm just focusing on these opacity keys and these opacity keys. So I'm going to go ahead and drag the opacity back for the bullet group and drag this back. And what I'm trying to do is turn the lock group on, where the locking mechanism will sort of grow out of this shape here. So what I want to do actually is turn the lock group on a little bit early, so that as they scale up, it grows out of there. Now, I don't like the transition here. The bullet group is growing a little too fast, so maybe I can scoot this out just a little bit. There we go. So you can see if we just keep moving those opacities around, we're going to get closer to the two shapes being the same size. And so that makes for a good transition. So let's see what it looks like at real time, and we may just be ready to move on. Okay, so that actually looks pretty good. Now, another thing that we can do to help that locking mechanism sort of pop up a little bit more is go in and actually animate that, that group there. So I'm going to go ahead and set a Y key for it. And then when it's at its highest point, we can make it bounce up and down. Okay. You can go ahead and add in the interpolation. Copy the interpolation from this main group here and paste it on this first key. Let's see what that looks like. I actually think if we pop it out even more here, it'll look better. Let's have it pop out there. And you know what? Instead of having it go down to its final position, since this will be its final position, let's go ahead and move that key to the end, and let's have it squash or go down farther. Sort of like we did with this. Remember, we did down, largest point, smaller than 100%, and then to its final position. That just really helps that bounce. So let's see what that looks like. And if we don't like it, we can take it out. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good. So we can move on and actually add in the next animation. So let's add in a new animation and call this hover _ idle. So this will be when we've got our bullet point moused over and we're still mousing over it. We can have an animation play. So once again, we want our this animation to start where on hover or the previous animation is going to end. So to do that, I'm just going to go through and select all of my ending keys here. So I just want to make sure I have all the keys. Basically, you want the last key for each property for each object. And to do that, you can marquee select and then hold Shift to add to your selection. So that was a key. This is a key and that one. Okay, so I've got all my keys selected. I'm just going to copy those, paste them onto the hover idle. Now you can see they're all spread out. So let's collapse those back to the beginning of the timeline. All right, and then I'm just going to go ahead and change their easing back to cubic. And that's just so we don't have a weird curve on any of these keys here. Okay, so to do this, what we're going to do is basically the same thing we did for the on hover animation, where we're going to start with the main group and add in some squash and stretch, and then we'll use that timing to inform us of the action of this locking mechanism, where we can open it and then close it. So once again, I'm going to use 10 milliseconds as my initial timing, and then we'll adjust it from there. So let's have it. Let's have the lock squash down. Now, instead of scaling it down the same, what we're going to do is squash it down on the Y, and I'm going to go down to 90%. And then stretch it out on the X. So we're going to go to 110. Now, for this, I am keeping the volume in mind. When I do these squash and stretches, if I scale it down on the Y 10%, I want to stretch it out 10% on the X. If you don't do that, there's going to be some noticeable warping with your shape, and it's just not going to look right. So we're keeping in mind our volume. Okay, so we've got that. Now we want to stretch it up into the Y. So let's just inverse these numbers here. So we need 110 on the Y and 90 on the X. Okay, and then we can bring it back down to 100 for both. Let's make sure we have cubic interpolation for all of these, and then take a look at that. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. Now, let's animate the locking mechanism. So when the squash happens, we can move it down. And then when it stretches, we want it to open up. So we'll move it up as far as we can. Like that. And then have it come down. So we actually want to move it past where the final position is, but we don't want to see that curve there. So I think I had it in the right spot, probably about right there. And let's bring it down to its final position, which will just be a little bit lower, just like that. Okay, let's remember to change our easing here. So I'm going to just add cubic there. And actually what I'm going to do is the 10 millisecond timing works, but I think I'm going to model the motion after what we did on this on hover, where we actually have 15 milliseconds to get that punchiness. So let's do that. I'm going to move these last two keys over so that we have 15 milliseconds between these two, and then just emulate that curve there. So I'm just going to give it a little bit less ease in than I did before. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now, we want to actually close it, but we don't want it to go straight from getting to its final position here and start having the animation play backwards. I think what we want to do is add in a pause. So let's add in a 10 millisecond pause. So to do that, I'm just going to go over 10 milliseconds on the timeline and then duplicate the last two keys here that we've created, and that'll keep it in the same spot. And now what we can do is go in and start copying these keys to their correct timing. So we're obviously going to need a little bit of extra space. So I'm going to go ahead and give myself 2 seconds on the timeline, and that should be enough space to get this done. Okay, so let's remember that this is our pause. So moving backwards from there, we need to put our next key in 10 milliseconds past this. So what do we have here? We need these keys here. So let's see, we're at 45. We need to go to 55. All right, so it'll stretch up, move up. All right, and then from this key to this key, remember we have 15 milliseconds. So let's figure that out. So 60, we need to go to 110. And then another 10 milliseconds from that to get us back to our final position, which is going to be 20F. Okay, let's also make sure that we have the same curves. So this is the wrong curve now because we're going back the opposite direction. So I'm going to reset that, and this curve needs to match this curve here. So let me copy that in. Go ahead and paste that there. All right, let's take a look at that. Okay, so that looks pretty good. The last thing that we need to do is make sure that we have the same amount of pause between the end of the animation and where it loops back. So we have a 10 millisecond pause. So from here, 30F. So this is where we need to loop back to the beginning of the animation. Now you can do this two ways. You can either use a work area to have it loop, or what you can do is just shorten the timeline. So I'm going to go ahead and set this animation to idle, and I'm just going to shorten the timeline. So we're at 130, so I can just type 130 in here, and that gets the timeline to the right length. And let's preview that. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. I think we can jump in and actually set up the state machine. Okay, so let's add a state machine. And if you remember from the preview before, we set up a sort of triangle pattern. So let's go ahead and add in our animations in that configuration. So we need the bullet idle first, and then it's going to go to on hover. Let's drag that in. And then it's going to go to hover idle, and then be able to go back to bullet idle. So now that we have all of our animations on our graph, let's add in the transitions and start configuring those. So remember, we need to go from entry to bullet idle. It's always going to go to bullet idle first. And then from bullet idle, we need to go to on hover, from on hover to hover idle, and then hover idle to bullet idle. Okay, so we've got our transitions set up, but we need to add in an input and start configuring our transitions. So the input that we need to use is a Boolean. And the reason that we're going to use a Boolean and not a trigger is that we want to be able to hold a true or false value for longer periods of time. So, the idle or the bullet point could sit there for a while before somebody actually hovers it, and then they could hover it for a while. So the Boolean is going to allow us to make that happen. So I'm going to add a Boolean and go ahead and rename it to hover. Oops. All right. And then let's start adding in the Boolean to where we need it to go. So we don't need to add it into the entry transition, but we do need to go from bullet idle to hover. So we don't want this to happen until somebody's actually hovering it, or this hover Boolean is true. So let's go into the transition, add a condition, and add the hover transition, or add the hover Boolean, and make sure that that's set to true. So now whenever we turn this on, it's not going to go away from this animation until we check this. Okay, and now we need to go back to bullet idle, but let's keep going through the process here. So it's going to play through the on hover animation, and then we want it to go from on hover to hover idle. So we don't need to add a condition here to this transition. So we want it to sit in hover idle until hover is now false, in which case it'll go back to the idle. So let's add in the condition here to this transition, and make sure instead of true, it's set to false. So let's preview this and see what it looks like, and then make some adjustments from there. Okay, so when we hit play, it's starting in the right configuration, which is good. And when I hit the hover button, okay, so it skips over our unhover animation. So we need to fix that. Now what happens when we go back to the bullet idle? Okay, that looks pretty good, but it is very snappy, so we'll fix that as well. All right, so to fix this animation being skipped, what we need to do is configure this transition here. Now we don't need any conditions because it is ending up on the right animation, but we want it to play this entire animation before going on to hover idle. So we're going to use exit time to achieve that. So we can enable exit time here, and we can either input the length of our animation, which I'm not sure the length of it, or we can use a percent. So I'm going to type in 100%. So that's telling this transition not to fire off until this animation has completely finished playing. So let's take a look at that and see if it fixed our problem. Okay, so that's fixed. Now, the last thing we want to do is make sure that the transition between hover idle and bullet idle looks a little bit better. Now, there's two ways we can do that. The first way is we could add in another animation that's like on hover that transitions us from this this hover idle animation. So we could go to there and then go back to bullet idle, or we can just use duration on this transition. Now, duration defines how long the two animations will mix together. And right now it's set to 0. So it's just going from one animation to the other instantly. Now, if we start adding some time to this, like I'll add 1,000 milliseconds, let's see what that looks like. So you can see that it's slowly transitioning back to that bullet idle. Now, the good thing about this is we can see that there's some things that aren't quite working right. You can see that the ellipse that we actually scaled up that's inside of our bullet point is going to the wrong position, and that's probably because we didn't key its position in the bullet idle, which we'll go and fix. And also you can see the opacities changing. So we're taking too much time. So let's start dropping this number down. And I'm just going to start cutting it in half. So now we're at 500 milliseconds, which is still a little too long. So let's go down to 250. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit closer. Let's go down to, I'm going to go down to 100. Okay, so aside from that ellipse scaling down in the wrong spot, you can see that it makes that transition look a little weird. I think it actually looks pretty decent. So you may drop it down a little bit more if you don't like it, but I think 100 milliseconds is pretty good. So let's go back to bullet idle here. And remember, we didn't key the position of this in this animation, which is why it's scaling down to the wrong position, because it doesn't have a value to mix back to. But when we key this position here now, and we play that state machine, you can see that now it's going back down in the center there. And let me slow it down just in case you can't see it on the video. It'll be a little bit easier with some more time. So you can see now it's scaling back down to that center point, which is exactly what we want. So let me change this back to 100. And yeah, there you go. So we've set everything up. We've got all of our animations done. Now it's time for the challenge. So let me show you the animation, or the icon and the animation that I've put together for it to sort of help you get to where you're going to go. And then yeah, we'll go from there. Okay, so this is the icon I want you guys to try this out on. If you don't try it out on this, go ahead and make your own icon and try and transform it. Now, the principles are the exact same. You're going to be using the exact same animations. Now, I don't have a hover idle animation, which is another thing that you can add. But I do have the hover animation. Now, the keys are relatively similar. There's some extra stuff in here. But you can see that the effect that I was going for is the exact same. It's all coming out of the center there. We have that dot morphing into this controller. And yeah, so it's the same principles, just with more things moving around. So I would challenge you to go through and try and set this up and add in that additional hover idle animation, and share those on the community, because I'd like to see if you guys can figure this out. And if you come up with something original, you might even get featured on the homepage. So, or not the homepage, but the community page. So that's going to be it. I hope y'all enjoyed the tutorial, and we'll be putting out more tutorials here in the near future. So I hope you come back for that. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, go ahead and leave us a comment, and we'll try to address those as quickly as possible. So yeah, that's it, and I'll see y'all in the next one.